Thank you very much. It seems like there's more people here from College Station than there are from like here, but that's cool. So yeah, I got my start in agriculture as a small kid. So I grew up mostly in the Midwest. We farmed corn and soybeans, and so that is my background. In 2017, I bought a Buckaroo hat and moved to Texas and had the privilege of doing a master's degree with Dr. Scott Nolsey. So at the time, he was brand new to Texas A&M, and I was his guinea pig. I was his first graduate student. And so got my start in weed science there and ended up staying on board. So I manage all of our program's research. So we do the major row crops within the state, so corn, cotton, soy, and sorghum. We do a little bit of rice, we do a little bit of turf. We dabble in rangeland activities as well, but kind of all things surrounding weed science. And so as an extension program, our job is not only to teach, but to understand and to learn. And so it's fun being able to do all sort of aspects and facets of those things. So what I have for y'all today is mostly warm season weed management, a few specifics that were given to me by the county agent. What I typically do when I go somewhere is about a week before I'll ask, hey, what are the most problematic species in your area, or at least the ones that you hear about? So if you don't hear about weeds, or you don't know, or don't see up here what you are dealing with, talk to your county agent, because they are the person, they are the people that informs us and specialists and research folks and all that to what the problems are that need to be solved and what needs to be talked about. So I will also bring up some spray water quality discussions as well, just because I've been getting a lot of questions about that just in the past like 18 months, and I don't know what sparked that, but it's a really good conversation to have, because as we go to make a herbicide application, if that's our choice, our mode that we're gonna control our weeds by, we can really set ourselves back and hurt ourselves if we don't have great quality water to begin with. So I don't mean to depress anyone to start off the beginning, but we find ourselves here and it's dry. So that to say, this is not a great time to go out and attempt to control weeds. Even though we often talk about many of our weed species, if they're a perennial plant, we want to go out in the fall and start to work on controlling those if a herbicide is the mode of action that we're going to use. And oftentimes for perennial plants, it is, because we have got to eliminate the root system. That is the intention and the purpose behind using a herbicide when we are targeting our perennial species. And so this QR code will take you to the drought monitor map. It is updated every Thursday. This is the most updated one. It's fun and sad to follow all at the same time. So we get a lot of questions on how plants respond to drought. We've had some pretty intense couple years here in the state of Texas, and what we have seen and what we see often in the literature is a few different things. So plants are always adapting to their surroundings, right? And so we somewhat are able to see this play out in real time as we think about what happens during a drought. So the quantity and the quality of seeds that a plant is going to produce is minimized. It's shut down quite a bit. There's going to be a lot less seed production, and the quality of those seeds is going to go down. And that quality affects germination and seedling vigor. So if you come at all from a cropping background or even a gardening background where you're just trying to grow something, you know that that seedling stage is very, very important, right? You've got to baby that plant through to where to get to a point where it can begin to sort of fight for itself and compete with all the surrounding vegetation. So if we have poor seedling quality, seed quality, we are not going to have very effective seedlings that are able to survive much plant competition. There's some transmissible effects that carry on into the next generations. And so those plants that do end up surviving in the next year, they come up, they grow, they go on to set seed. Oftentimes that seed does have the genetic predisposition to perhaps endure drought just a little bit better. And so for every drought that we go through, Some of our plants are becoming more and more adapted to that. And so in general, you can keep in mind that grasses and broadleaves are a little bit different. Broadleaves, remember, just have that giant taproot that can go straight down and find the moisture. So grasses don't necessarily have the ability to survive drought to the extent that broadleaf plants do. The best thing you can do to hold back weeds and plants you don't want is to have a good forage stand. So I'm taking all this from a forage perspective where we have livestock grazing or we're growing it as a crop for hay. Controlling stock density and grazing, taking care of weed problems early, fertilizing according to soil test recommendations, all these things, it's just good forage management. That's going to get you a leg up in terms of being able to control your weeds. So we'll run through relatively quickly some warm season weeds that we often run into or your county agent has necessarily recommended or talked about. A couple of these, or at least one of them, are brush species. I am not a brush guy. I am becoming a brush guy. I'm going to give you the contact of the lady that is, I call her the brush queen of Texas. She's down in Uvalde, and she is incredibly helpful when it comes to knowing how to manage some of these brush species. So Johnson grass, this is something that we have gotten more questions on in the past 2 years probably than ever before, even as far west as Kerrville and a little bit beyond. And we are finding that in a forage scenario, if you have got improved Bermuda grasses or you're out in a native rangeland setting, we are finding that Outrider does really, really well. Historically, a lot of folks have used Pastora. It's going to seem like I bash on Pastora a little bit in this talk. I don't mean to. It's just that there are other options out there that might be a little bit better fit. Pastora is a really good product that can be helpful in many scenarios, but sometimes there are other things out there that are just less known about. The problem with Outrider, this is somewhat wrong. I want you to go out at 1 ounce and a third. Research this year sort of confirmed that, and I have not necessarily updated this. 1 ounce and a third is just more consistent if things turn off dry. So if you go out spray Johnson grass in the spring when they're about 1.5 feet tall, you're going to get really good control unless 2 weeks after that application, rains just shut off and we don't see anything for the rest of the summer. I have one trial location that's been kind of like that this year, just trying to confirm what we're actually seeing. And that seems to be the case. 1 ounce and a third does much better than just 1 ounce. Don't mix this with products that have any amine formulation herbicide in them. So that's your Weed Masters, your Grazons, et cetera, et cetera. Basically anything that has 2,4-D dicamboaminopyrrolid, picloram, fluoxapyr, triclopyr, et cetera, it's going to reduce the efficacy on that grass. Johnson grass is problematic because of prussic acid issues, and so this is why most folks are trying to get rid of this in their improved forage scenario. If you are in just a straight up grazing sort of scenario, it is likely that this plant is just going to get grazed out. It doesn't tolerate heavy grazing very well. It doesn't even tolerate moderate pressure very well. And so this is for those that are really trying to grow a quality hay crop. There are some suggestions on the left-hand side. Annual broomweed, we'll talk about perennial broomweed as well, but annual broomweed, this is what you want to target. This is never what we see by the time we need to go control and control the plant. It always seems as though by the time we have the yellow flowers, that's when people start asking, hey, what do I need to do about that? This is when we want to control it. So if you can learn to identify it before you've identified it by just the yellow flowers, you're going to have a lot better success, because by the time we get to the yellow flower stage, it's just too late to do much of anything besides mow it down. And if we mow it, those seeds really like scarification. So that's just like a roughing up of the seed. And that makes it much more willing to germinate in the next year. So mowing it is not necessarily helpful, although it's very therapeutic and solves a quick, ugly issue, does it not? So if you can learn to identify it and spray it at this like 6-inch or less stage, you're going to have great control for relatively cheap. You can do anything in the auxin family. So these are your really affordable 2,4-D and dicamba products. You can get into things like aminopyrrolid, Chaparral and Cimarron Plus do really, really well on this. There's just not a whole lot of other things that you can do to battle against this plant besides spraying and a good stand of forage. With any of these products, always include a surfactant. They are cheap and they work. It's not just another thing to have some margin on for the salesman, I promise. Broom snakeweed. So this is sort of the other plant that is very much a lookalike. So if I go back to the annual broomweed, flower structure, plant structure, I mean just about everything is relatively similar leaf structure, except this guy starts branching as soon as it comes up out of the ground. If it's an annual, in terms of being broomweed, it's going to come up, produce a stem, and then branch out. If you have broom snakeweed, or the perennial snakeweed as people call it, it is going to branch as soon as it comes up out of the ground. It's a nice little bush. Other than that, very similar plant. It's a perennial, however. So your management for how you're going to control this is a little bit different in terms of timing and product selection. This is a really hard plant to manage otherwise and to get off of your property long term otherwise. Spraying it is kind of the only way to deal with it. So it is a perennial, which means we're going to target our applications for this plant in the fall. It also means you're going to target applications about the time that it's flowering or just thereafter when the seed is maturing. And that is because at that point what the plant is doing is sending as much of its carbohydrate reserves and energy down into the roots so it can put on as much root mass in those last weeks or months of the plant's life and survive underground over winter and come back for the next year. So we want to catch that train that's moving from above ground to below ground, put the herbicides on it and let it do its work. And so remember I said the goal there is to eliminate the root system. That's really what we're after. These guys put on a ton of seed that are very, very germinable as long as they have light and you've got a couple of days worth of rain, you're going to have a whole lot of plants that start to pop up. These seeds don't necessarily have to be scarified, but it does help. And so mowing is just another one of those things. If you're going to go out and mow this plant down, I prefer you do it at flowering or before. If it's flowered or after, I would rather you spray it because you're going to do a much better job at controlling that root system and keeping it from coming back in the next year. You're also more likely to catch that plant just before those seeds are mature enough, ripe enough to actually come up out of the ground. So you might be able to damage that plant enough that those seeds are no longer viable. Picloram at 16 to 32 ounces. If you're going to go in the fall, which I recommend, 16 ounces is all you need. That's a pretty affordable application, very easy to do. You can also use chlorsulfuron plus MSM, so you don't need an applicator's license for this product. It's Cimarron Plus. You're going to pay more for it. It works just as well. Include a surfactant with either of these. If you want to spray in the spring, you just don't want anything out there at all. I get it. You can go out with 32 ounces of picloram. Now, why more in the spring? The plant's tissues and root system just don't respond in the spring like they do in the fall. That's just sort of how it happens to be with this plant. It is best to wait if you can. Caveats, as always, with spraying and with weed management, if you're going to go out during a drought, expect less. That's all I can tell you. If you've got decent ground moisture, good growing conditions, the soil's not 100 degrees at the surface, it's a good time to spray. If all those things happen to be true, then it's probably not a good time to spray. Willow. So I've gotten 2 or 3 questions on this from folks basically west of Austin. And so I am not a brush guy by any means, although I am learning. This plant I have understood to be relatively difficult to control if you don't time it right. The problem being that when we turn off dry, it hardens up really, really fast and just doesn't move. It survives really, really well in drought. And so that can tell you something about a plant's ability to process, metabolize, and move herbicide through it. If it survives drought really, really well, it probably shuts down to the point where it's almost dormant with green leaves on it and perhaps some flowers and seed heads, but there's just not much going on within, which means anything we put to that plant is just not going to be moved around in the capacity we need it to be able to get full control. So when it's actively growing, it's got to be green at minimum. I don't care if it's flowering or not flowering, that's fine. The best thing that I have seen for this so far is 25% triclopyr, 75% diesel in one tank. Spray the plant to wet, doesn't need to be dripping running off of it. Yes, it's a legal application to have diesel fuel in there. The EPA has approved this label. They know it's there, they know what's happening. But preferably on the lower 18 inches of that plant and get the trunk. That's the best thing you can do. You don't necessarily have to cover the whole thing. I have found that I tell people that and they do it anyway because it makes them feel good. More power to you, I get it. There's another option that's out there that I like. People get moderately uncomfortable with it that are not familiar with the brush control world and working with herbicides, pesticides, etc. And I understand why. There is a soil treatment you can do. Hexazinone is the product, comes in Velpar, LCU I think is a brand name product now, Tide or Velosa. There may be some generics out there or post-patent products. I'm not 100% sure on that at the moment. For every 3 feet of height or canopy diameter, so tall or wide, whichever is greater, put down 3 mils just around, I'll say the base of the plant, within like a foot of the base of the plant, around the outside. So you're gonna need a what's called an exact apply gun for this. It's a little bit different. It's gonna be able to dial in 3 mils really, really well. If you go try to spray 3 mils from just a squirt bottle or your backpack sprayer, I promise you, you're gonna put out a whole lot more than you actually think that you are. But it's a really good option. You can also get something called, I don't have it in this presentation, Pronone power pellets. There are a limited number of folks that actually sell these, but you can buy them online. They are probably your more expensive option, but they are the most convenient thing ever when it comes to brush control. They are penny-sized tablets that are hexazinone, been compressed, dried. All you need to do, open up the container, put on a glove, pop 1 down or 2 down, read the label directions. I think it's 1 per every stem or 1 per every 3 inches of stem diameter, somewhere in there, at the base of the plant, and then let Mother Nature do its work. What you're looking for is a rain shower to come through, melt that tablet down into the ground. It'll be taken up by the roots on its way out. Really, really simple, really, really easy product to use. Okay, spray water quality. So, like I said, this is something we have been getting lots of questions on, and so there are a number of different things that I look at when I'm sort of evaluating water in terms of its quality to be able to be used for spraying, whether it's herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, anything else really. I want a water report, and I'll show you how to get one of those in a moment. The 4 things that I'm really looking hard at when it comes to water: pH, hardness, conductivity, and then your other basics. Temperature, turbidity. Is it super cloudy? Is it really gross? Did it come straight up out of your pond that your cows have been swimming in, etc.? There's a few other things that you can look at, but not necessarily important. These are, I'll say, the top 3 things that I really look at, and then paying attention to number 4 there as much as I can. This is what a standard water report looks like from Texas A&M. If you have never received one of these before, I highly encourage you. It's cheap. If you consider the information that you're obtaining from this, even spending $75 for the Cadillac sample, where you're looking at a routine analysis of everything you see on the left, plus metals, plus heavy metals, plus fluoride, you're getting a pretty good deal, because you really only need to do this once. I know a lot of folks that do this maybe once a year, do it once every couple of years, or they do it maybe different seasons or after major events, weather events that have happened. Hurricane comes through, perhaps not over here. Major drought event comes through, major rainfall event comes through. You want to see how your water is being impacted. So the first thing I look at when I'm looking at my soil report or my water report is pH. And so pH, it's a big deal, but there's not a whole lot you can do about it. I just want to know where it's at so that if I have a problem, I could point back to it and say, yes, that was perhaps the cause, no, that was not the cause. pH is just simply a measure of hydrogen ions swimming around in whatever solution we're testing for. Okay, so it's a logarithmic scale, and all that means is that's why it's a really big deal when we go from 7 to 7.2. There's a lot more happening in that 0.2 worth of change than meets the eye. So, acidic water, there's pH scale down on the bottom here, and you can kind of see as it runs from the middle being our sort of neutral zone and where I want you to be using your water at. You get up on the right-hand side, water is very alkali or very basic. Left-hand side, water is very acid or acidic. So if you have acidic water, there are a few different things that can happen that can sort of impair your pesticide application. Things I am often thinking about are herbicides that are already weak acids that might contribute more acidity to that solution. So if we've just gone from like a 5.5 or a 6 as our water sits, and then we add something like glyphosate, glufosinate, 2,4-D, dicamba, depending on the formulations, we can make that water maybe push it down to like a 5. The plant is not as willing to accept something that has about a 5 pH through its stomata and through its cuticle and et cetera, as it is if it's got more of a neutral pH. So we might slow or all out stop the ingestion of the pesticide application with the plant if we've got too acidic conditions. On the other hand, if we've got too basic conditions, we typically see faster breakdown of that actual pesticide product that's in the tank. So it's just not able to sit as long. If you mix up and then suddenly the weather changes or you have to run off and go take care of something, that product may have broken down beyond the point where it's really going to be as effective as you want it to be if you go out tomorrow or the next day or the next day and apply it. So that's kind of what we're looking for. Ideally, I want you to be in that 6 to 8 range. There are some herbicides that play well with higher pHs. I typically sit at about an 8, 8.5 on most of the water I end up using for all my spray jobs. And it does just fine because most of the products we add to the tank are going to lower the pH. Some of them tolerate higher pH, and a lot of these you might recognize nickel-sulfuron, it's in Pastora. Are the sulfonylureas, ALS inhibitors. These are products like Cimarron that can handle that. Hardness. So hardness just comes from an abundance of mostly these ions over here. And these are sort of ranked as to, I'll say, the most strong to the least strong, meaning it just takes a little bit of iron to make a really big difference. It takes quite a bit of potassium to make a difference. And so you're going to find all of these elements in any water that you sample, the degree to which is going to vary quite a bit as you run across the state. So even depending on where you're at over here in the hill country, you might have quite a bit different water going from one location to the next, even from city to well to whatever water sources you may have. Hard water can also prevent or slow the entrance of that target pest, or at least allowing that herbicide application in. Same thing with insecticides if you've got a systemic product. The other thing that really is more of a concern with hard water is just the precipitating out of that product in the tank. So over time, it does not take long. It looks like it has been mixed well, it's in solution. Your tank looks nice and even, you don't have any clobs sitting anywhere, there's not a bunch of it sitting on the bottom. But what's actually happening at the molecular level, at the microscope level, I'll say, is that those herbicide or insecticide molecules are just not holding on to the water well enough. You start going down the road, you start spraying, it doesn't take a whole lot of time for those to just sort of settle out and end up sitting in the bottom of the tank, and to either get put out at way too high a dose in one area or just not evenly distributed very well at all. So I get asked all the time, what's the threshold for water hardness? Over in College Station, we have very soft water, as opposed to what many people think, but we have lots of sodium in our water. And so it appears that we have hard water, but it's actually very soft. So what is sort of my threshold? We are far below that. I tend to look at several different things when it comes to water hardness and what product you're using. I would refer you to that product label, because often if there is a concern with the product that you're going to be spraying and water quality in terms of hardness, softness, it's going to state it. If it's not there on the label, I wouldn't worry too much about it. What else? How to fix it. So I don't have hard water, and yet I add AMS almost to all of my spray applications, because what AMS does is ties up any of these elements before you start putting other products in the tank. So it's going to bind onto those so that your herbicides have a better chance at binding to the water, and not just with one of these and then going and sitting at the bottom of the tank. I have lots of sodium in my water in College Station. I have lots of calcium, but I don't have a lot of iron, magnesium, or potassium. So it shows up as having soft water, but I still need that AMS to tie these guys up before I end up going and mixing everything else. Conductivity and total dissolved salts, also an issue. So really what I'm looking at here is I want you to have 500, 600 or less microsiemens per centimeter in terms of your soil or your water test that you're receiving back. I'll show you kind of what that looks like in a moment. If you have greater than that, it's okay, it's workable. I just want you to look at what elements are actually causing that. If it's iron, then not a whole lot we can do about that. We can add AMS, but like I said, a little bit of iron makes a really big difference. If it's something like sodium or other salts, then we can use an AMS or an ANF substitute to be able to take care of that relatively easily and not have much of an issue. Total dissolved salts is really just another way of saying conductivity. It's just it takes the conductivity measurement and puts it in a different language, I'll say. So can it be adjusted? Yes and no. AMS can help tie up some of the things that might cause high conductivity, but depending on what's causing it, there's not a whole lot we can do about it. Sometimes we just have to roll with it and take it for what it is. Other problems that we may have, bicarbonates, I don't typically see this in the state of Texas. Maybe out here you might. Where I'm at in East, certainly not. If you're spraying group 1s, so any of the DIMs or FOPs, clethodim, quizalofop, fluazafop, these are our grass killers. They selectively target grasses. Not super common from a forage perspective, but sometimes we can get into situations where we need to spot spray or whatever have you with some of these products. If you're sitting at 500 parts per million or less, you're fine. If you're a little bit more, just add some UAN. It's a different type of fertilizer. That's going to take care of some of the antagonizing issues that you get with that on those products. Turbidity, just pay attention. Is your water full of clay, silt, sand, or organic material of any kind that can really just grab onto those product molecules before they can actually get into the plant? Because if they are bound, they are not going to get into the plant. If they do get into the plant, they are not going to be mobilized at all within the plant. They're not going to do their job. There's a decent amount of literature out there that suggests there is sort of a window in terms of temperature. It's not something I am overly concerned about, except last year when I went to pull a water sample, or no, I just went to fill up a tank, and I could almost just not touch the water comfortably. That was coming out of a black runoff tank that we have down at the farm that we sometimes use. And it was up above 120 degrees. And I said, that's probably not going to be super helpful when it comes to using this for spraying or at least mixing product into. And sure enough, it turns out if you have water that is overly cool, water that is overly hot, products are just not going to mix well and to sit well in that water. So that's something to pay attention to as well. Typically not going to be an issue. So you get your or your water test back. You keep saying soil test. You get your water test back, and what do you do with all the numbers? A&M is not the only lab you can use. There's plenty of different services out there that you can use. Lots of different information you'll get back. Some of the units you're going to receive are not all going to be uniform, and they're going to change sometimes from lab to lab. A quick Google search or just calling the lab and saying, hey, explain this to me, is a really good way to fix that. But the first thing I'm looking at, pH. 8.61. It's a little bit high for what I like. Can I do anything about it? Not right now, I'm not going to, because I still have yet to add anything to the tank, depending on what I'm going to apply for most of our pasture and I'll even say rangeland products, hayfield products. They're going to acidify the water. And so I'm not going to worry about that at all. What about hardness? That is down here. There are two different measurements given. I want you to pay attention to the parts per million. 11 is very, very soft, I promise. There's lots of different charts out there that sort of go through, hey, here's how you would define your water based on a number like this. But sometimes they give it in different units. So it's just something to pay attention to. If you're trying to say, I have soft water, I have hard water, very soft, very hard, etc. Look at the units. Always look at the units. So no issues here. Conductivity, where are we at? Conductivity, 730. That would be ohms per centimeter, basically, which is a relatively old measurement. There are other units you're going to find at different labs, but nonetheless, this works. I have got soft water, high conductivity. That means I have got something up here causing an issue when it comes to conductivity. And I can see that sodium is at 224 parts per million. That's a little high. It's kind of salty for my liking. And so I'm going to go ahead and add AMS, just ammonium sulfate, into the tank. It's very cheap. It's very easy to do. It mixes very well. The only real thing to pay attention to with that is if you are overspraying an area that you don't want to ding up or injure in any capacity, any forage that you have out there at all. AMS, just be warned, is a pretty strong fertilizer. And when put into a spray solution, it can burn leaf material of the plants that you are not trying to harm. And so I have seen it burn Bermuda grass. I have seen it burn some natives. The way around that is to spray it and then let it get a rain on it or irrigate it. That is kind of the only way that you're going to be able to circumvent that. Some years it's worse than others. It just depends on the growing conditions that you have. And so the next thing, do I have any other issues? My temperature's fine. I don't have really cloudy or muddy water. Bicarbonates are approaching getting a little high, but I am likely to tie up some of those with AMS, not quite as well as I'm going to with the UAN. So there's just two different fertilizers that you can use to adjust things. There is a whole slew of products out there that you can use to modify your water. We call them all sorts of different things, and some of them we call snake oil. Unfortunately, not all things are created equal, and so buying from reputable brands, not just something you've never heard of off of Amazon, makes a really big difference. If the people selling it can tell you about the product, can tell you their experience, and even other people's experience with the product, I'm good with that. If they just want to sit and say, it's the best stuff ever, it's going to fix all your issues, doesn't matter what kind of water you have, you put this in first, it's going to solve it, I'm leery of that. So this is a little bit different water test where I've got lower sodium, I've got still soft water, my pH is still a little bit high, and a lot of the same things apply. My conductivity is not quite as astounding as it was with the previous water report, and so I may or may not do anything about that. In this instance, it's going to depend for me on the cost of the application. Am I going out with a very affordable, cheap product, or am I going out with a very expensive product that may even be hard to get, or I had to wait for a long time for the shipment to come in on? If that application is very valuable to you, I would go ahead, hedge your bets, and use some AMS. Other issues, nothing significant here. Bicarbonates are significantly lower. Okay, so the last 10 minutes or so, we'll go through sandbur. So how many of y'all have sandbur? Oh my gosh. I'm gonna need y'all all to collect some for me and send it so I can see exactly what it is that you have. So Leanne told you I was working on a doctorate degree. I've been working on that several years. It's fun having a family and working full time and letting that be your hobby. It's a horrible hobby. I don't suggest it. But the whole doctorate degree is surrounded around sandbur. And so really the things that we are after there is how to manage for it long term, what do we have within the state, and what else is there across the southeastern United States. I've gotten other samples in from various different parts of the country as well. We're just trying to get a grasp on what all is out there and how it behaves before we really dig into more of the biology of the plant, which honestly there's been a lot of work done. So I'll present quite a bit of that here today. If anything, you'll walk away just knowing more about the plant. That's fun, right? I will give you sort of a game plan at the end for what you might need to do to be able to manage it. I say manage, and I stay away from the word control because I have yet to see full 100% complete eradication of this plant from anywhere. The only thing I have ever seen successful eradication of is really the boll weevil pest, and that is still around. We still collect every now and again. We still collect a moth. We still collect an insect every so often. And so, what is sandbur? Is it an annual? Is it a perennial? Is it both? This is one of the bigger questions that we end up getting, and that we know of. So if you look in any textbook, it's going to say it's an annual that overwinters. What the heck does that mean? It just like hangs out in the winter and then starts growing again. Does it die back? Typically what we see is it dies back and then it puts on green foliage in the spring, and often only does that once or twice. Beyond twice, I have yet to be able to be, I cannot reproduce that in the greenhouse. I have anecdotal stories of people saying, yep, I got the same plant that has come back like 5 times. I'm like, why are you watching one sandbur plant and not just pulling it up out of the ground? You're not a doctorate student, don't do that. Like, it's not worth your time, I promise. That we know of, not all plants are this way. Most of the sandburs that are out there are annuals, and that's really good news because they're much easier to manage than the perennials are. The question becomes, are our winters hard enough to kill these perennials? Generally south of I-40, no. Where's I-40 at? That's in Oklahoma. It cuts the state north and south, runs east and west. So one of the extension agronomists up at OSU has been looking at this plant for like a decade or so, probably 12 years now, I guess. And he has observed that he finds almost 0 perennial plants north of I-40, and he will find some just south of I-40. He will find a whole lot along the Red River, which means for us in the state of Texas, we're gonna have perennials and we're always gonna have perennials. Our winters are just not hard enough. We don't get a hard enough freeze to kill out that crown that overwinters. So, I've heard lots of wonderful stories about, man, I've got perennials, I got these huge plants. When you get out this way, there are some different sandburs. Different ones than what is distributed mostly across the United States. There are things like big sandbur, giant sandbur. There's some others. These plants get like 6 feet in diameter. They put on, just hog-sized burrs. I have yet to find them outside of like a rangeland setting. I have not found them in anybody's yard, ditch, roadway. I have not found them in a forage. I've not found them in grazing really grazing areas. This has been more, I'll say, deserty type areas, far west Texas. And so I don't think some of those larger plants have the ability to really just withhold and sustain themselves over this way. So what we deal with primarily are field sandbur, long spine sandbur, and coastal sandbur. They're all just a little bit different. They are all equally as awful and annoying. And really, only field sandbur is the one that perennializes. It's also the most common. So that kind of stinks. But this is what one of those plants looked like. This was a plant I dug up. Let me see. Okay, I do show it. This was a plant I dug up in 2023, I believe it was. And he had overwintered. I kind of tracked it through the winter. This was at our farm in Burleson County, so just west of College Station. A few things to notice about this plant. We've got a crown, and it's about 3/4 of an inch worth of crown there. You're often going to find either one solid crown, or you're going to find sort of like a mess of crownal tissue sort of at that location where it doesn't feel like there's one crown to really like cut through or to look at and observe. It roots at the nodes, so that instantly gives indication that spray coverage, if we go to spray something like this plant, is really important. It also gives you indication that if you go to pluck this plant up out of the ground and you happen to break off the stolon, that whole entire thing right there is going to survive on its own, no problem. So you've gotten rid of the mama, but the baby's still hanging out there and is eventually going to become a mama. So that's an issue. It sort of mimics some of our forages. I have been tracking a spread of this that is slowly moving out from an area at the Beef Cattle Center. I don't know how many of y'all were animal science majors at A&M. Anyone? So the O.D. Butler Center, just off of Highway 60, there is a patch of sand on the left-hand side. So it's now the Sheep Cattle Center, or sheep cattle. It's now the sheep and, what is it called? Sheep and something else. Research center. They have a giant pocket of sand in a pasture, and that is the only place I can find sandbur in that area. And it has slowly been spreading out, and what I think to a degree is happening is when they go through and disc that up to actually plant it for oats in the fall, they are breaking these plants up. I think when we disc like now, and then we get rain, these roots are not having any difficulty reestablishing at all. And so I think all we're doing oftentimes by disking up this plant is either breaking up that crown or breaking up these stolons and some of these roots into more plants. It appears to me that because those plants sort of mimic, at least in the leaf structure, some of our improved forage grasses, that a lot of these populations go unnoticed on larger ranches. People that have smaller land holdings tend to be just more familiar with their ground, or they don't have employees that are going out managing things for them that may not be paying specific attention to things like this. So you'll notice that the only seed head on this plant is like a foot away from the actual crown itself. I've heard of lots of spot spray failures, so people going out and just spot spraying individual plants, and I think this is why, because they're only finding where those seed heads are, only spraying right here. Probably not going to be enough coverage to kill everything over here. Furthermore, if you don't have a seed head, and this is sitting in a mix of really healthy Bermuda grass or other forage, have you just missed the plant in its entirety? Probably so. So, some comparisons, identifying the perennials. So how do you know if you have perennials? You want to know if you do or not because it changes how you're going to manage for this plant. Find some of those carcasses in the winter, so the time is coming up after everything's sort of gone dormant and sat really nice and cold for a few, give it a few weeks. Let everything die back and all the green tissue go away. You want to find some of those plants that you knew where they were last year and cut the crown open. So you're looking for like 1/2 inch to a 3-inch crown. And there's a few things that you're looking for. So The first is green tissue, and it is pale green. Some of y'all are sitting out there saying there's no green in that picture except for a few leaves up here. And that green in the crown or the root area is not because there's a little bit of foliage coming up out of it, but it is because that plant is still alive even though it sat dormant in the cold of winter all year long. So if you ever took a forage management grazing course, whether it was soil and crop sciences or the rangeland or ecosystem sciences department, you know kind of what you're looking for when you're looking at a perennial grass. This is what you're looking for. Cut the crown open. It's going to be very pale green, but if there's any green there, it can come back in the next year. This plant I dug up early February last year, February 1st. It was 37-degree average soil temperature for that day. And it already had green on it because we had went through a little bit of a warm spell. And this plant, I would reckon that it would survive that 37-degree temperature. It's probably not going to grow very fast right after that, but it will recover. It was moderately well protected down in the mess of grass and weeds, other plants that were growing there. So these perennials are problematic, not just because they are more difficult to control, but also because they produce foliage earlier in the year, quicker than the annuals will germinate, which means they put on seed heads quicker, which means they also produce more seeds. So they have a lot more time to kick out progeny. So of those seedlings then, what are we looking at? Most seeds that are sitting in the ground from any given crop the previous year are going to germinate in the spring and again in the fall. It's soil temperature driven, so you gotta have soil temps just right and soil moisture just right. Really any soil moisture will do after any given rainfall once you get into this soil temp range. So you need an average of these temperatures for like 5 to 7 or 10 days for things to really start popping. And that is sort of your cue for your latest time that you can use pre-emergent herbicides. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. Each of these burrs has 2 to 3 capsules in it. So that actual like burr, the part that makes you cuss, is not the seed. The seeds are in that. That's what protects the seeds. Those seeds are relatively weak. They can break down relatively easy. I have found that roughing them up, at least in the greenhouse, some different studies that we're doing, almost destroys the seed in its entirety. But it needs a little bit of roughing up for it to really imbibe moisture and to get growing and get going. And so foot traffic, whether it be human or livestock, and driving across your pastures is about just enough for that to happen. There is one large seed in there if you crack it open, and then there's going to be 1 or 2 other smaller seeds. That first seed has some hormonal properties to it that it needs to get up and out of the way for those other 1 or 2 seeds to go ahead and germinate. So it has sort of a strategy for prolonging germination. So let's say that primary seed germinates in the spring. Those other 1 or 2 may germinate in the fall or in the next year. That's sort of its strategy to keep you on your toes and really upset. There is a great tool out there for monitoring soil temperature. There's lots of different tools. If you just punch into Google soil temp monitoring or soil temp apps, whatever, you're going to find a whole slew of them. This one I have found to be the most accurate. It was developed for the golf course or turf grass industry, but based on the network that it uses for soil temp data, it works everywhere. It's always about within 1 or 1.5 degrees of what's actually happening if you were to pluck a soil temp thermometer or just like a meat thermometer in the ground. You only need, remember, in the upper 50s, lower 60s, just a few days worth of those average soil temperatures for germination to really start happening. So this tells you, am I too late to go out and spray or not with a pre-emergent herbicide? You're going to get, this year, you'll get current data. You can select all sorts of like different date structures to be able to look at, and then you can look at 5 and 10-year running averages. So it's really good, really useful for lots of other things. If you're planting lots of stuff, can be very helpful. So a pre-emergent herbicide, if you want to battle sandburr, is going to be the foundation for what you're going to do. Resilon does really, really well as a pre-emergent herbicide on small seeded annual grasses, ryegrass, sandbur, bromus species, anything that you're going to seed into your forage area. So keep that in mind if you're trying to repair areas and you want to use a pre-emergent to hold back your sandbur. It's really strong, it lasts a long time, it does its job very, very well, but because of that, it makes it really difficult to work with from a replanting or reestablishing scenario. So some things to think about. Traditionally, we have always used Prowl H2O, that is fine, you can use that. This buys you time. This can be sprayed and sit out there for like 3-4 weeks before it starts breaking down in efficacy without having any sort of like rainfall to really even get it working. And so Prowl, if you go out and spray it and you don't get a rainfall on it within 5 to like 7 days, it's gonna start degrading in efficacy really hard, really fast. This will not. We use this out west in rangelands across the western United States for cheatgrass control, and it does awesome. Sometimes we'll misforecast something, put it out, and that rain shower did not come through that area, and we have to wait another 2, 3, 4 weeks before we get a rain, and it still works. Pendimethalin just would not. It's just the reality that they're different products. So it's safe for Bermuda grass, Bahia grass forages, safe in natives. It is safe in things like climb grass, buffalo grass. I mean, any of these perennial grass forages that you might have out there, it's going to be safe in. Does a really good job at not affecting those. Don't need much rainfall to get it incorporated and working into the soil. You need to use a boomed sprayer and not a boomless sprayer. The problem that we run into with the boomless sprayers is that at the tips of the fan that it produces, we don't get quite the coverage that we need to prevent gaps between each droplets where sandbur may pop through. So I suggest if you are in a sort of scenario where you got lots of trees, obstacles, whatever have you, and you have to use a boomless sprayer, attempt to traverse the ground twice, just perpendicular to each other. And put out half the rate each time so that the full rate has been put out after you've done each of those passes. That has been sort of my suggestion for folks that are in that scenario, and it's worked. It's not quite as effective as just going out with the boom sprayer where it's nice and even across that fan and across the boom, but it is what it is. So for y'all over here, I would say 3 ounces in February. It feels early, it is early, and that's the point. I want you to get it out, get it rained on for it to begin working, and not try and time it with the soil temperatures. If you wait and you've seen that it's not been quite warm enough for germination, I'm not finding plants out there, go ahead and get it out, that's fine. And then another 3-ounce shot after your first hay cutting or after a really big grazing event, depending on how you manage your property. You can go out with 1 shot of 5 ounces. And if you're in that 20-inch rain belt, that might work just fine. But for us over east, we have to do a 3 followed by 3 because that 5 ounces is just kind of gone by midsummer. For y'all, it probably won't be. Because oftentimes with Rejuvera, which is the rangeland products, we'll go out with 5 ounces and expect 12 months worth of control out of it. And so that's sort of your game plan. This product mixes well and plays well with others. It just has to go in the tank first. So if you want to get out and spray for insects, other weeds, anything else, just put this in the tank first, let it get all mixed up. This is what happens if you don't. This was like just basic Roundup and then Resilon mixed in, and it's just a gloopy, nasty, gummy mess that you're gonna have your kids or your nephews clean up because you for sure aren't doing that. Some basic things going forward in Dazaflam use, single act or sequential programs, so that's the Resilon. Provide really consistent control of those annuals. The perennials is the problem. There's 2 different things you could use. I have one of those things on there because the other product I'm just less and less happy with as time goes on. It seems to be really expensive for sometimes what it does. When it works really, really well. It's kind of like technology. So glyphosate works really, really well. spot spray those plants. You can go out with an application of broadcast glyphosate across the forage after you have really heavily grazed that down to the ground or you've taken a hay cutting. I mean, do it as soon as you get those bales out of there. I want it within like 7 days of that cutting if you can. I know that's moving quick for some folks, but that's going to limit the injury and impact to your forage. It's also going to make that application not quite as effective on the sandbur as it would be otherwise if you were just to go out broadcast and not worry about your forage at all. You may or may not lose a cutting depending upon the year or grazing event, however you manage your place. I always suggest spot spraying if you can manage. Control areas at a time so that you're just not wiping out all of your productivity in one fell swoop or getting yourself into a bind. Whether you're haying or whether you're in a consistent grazing scenario, the management doesn't really change a whole lot. Watch for the perennials, understand where they're at, get at those as soon as you can so that you can minimize the seed going into the soil as much as you can. Flash grazing instead of glyphosate. I've got a lot of questions of, can I just graze this plant down to the nubbins before it sets on a seed head and expect it to be eliminated or controlled? And generally the answer is no. I've never really seen a population decrease because of flash grazing, where you just send in all the livestock you can, let it get down to the nubbins. It just doesn't seem to work. It's going to set back your forages quite a bit. I wouldn't recommend it. Final recommendations, you could take a picture of this, basically everything I just said. Traditionally, we have always suggested Pastora as a broadcast treatment, and I've not talked about that just because everyone sort of knows about it. You can do it. If you read the product label though, you will find that it says apply and expect control to 1.5 inch tall plants or smaller. I don't know anyone that is going out and spraying 1.5 inch tall sandbur plants with anything, because at 1.5 inch tall, we don't even know it's there yet. So what to expect out of Pastora, and I tell you this because it's an expensive product and I don't want you to feel like you're just wasting time and money by using it if it doesn't go as well as you had hoped. Expect suppression. You're going to slow those plants down quite a bit. They're going to produce less seed, and it's going to hold off in terms of when those seeds are actually produced. It can work just fine. I've seen it control, 5 inch, 6 inch plants, but the environmental conditions, growing conditions have to be just right. That plant has to be really happy for all of that to take place and it to work just right. There is a brand new, everything I just said is in that publication. I mean, absolutely everything. Leanne has those in the next room over. If you've not already gotten one, they may all be snagged up and taken. That QR code will take you directly to the page where you can download it. You think you have to put in your email address? Sorry. Nothing I can do about that, but that is the updated pub. Everything you want to know about sandbur is in there.